Hello, everybody. I'm Robbie Faring. Thank you for listening to this presentation. In this talk, I'm pulling together what we've read and what I've researched about food systems to answer a basic question. Why do environmental harms keep happening even when most people say that they want sustainability? Two ideas guide us. First, the treadmill of production from 20 lessons in environmental sociology. That's going to explain how our rules, markets, and institutions constantly push producers to scale up and cut costs, even if that means offloading pollution or resource depletion into the environment. Second, Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence shows that a lot of damage is gradual, cumulative, and often hidden in day-to-day life, especially for communities with less political power. With those lenses, I'll connect causes, consequences, and realistic leverage points for change, keeping this clear and practical so it's useful beyond the sociology class. Here's the plan. First, I'll outline key causes, which are fishing pressure and contamination, monocultures and corporate agriculture, invasive species and infrastructure corridors, and finally, food waste and supply chain risk. Then I'll spell out the ecological and social consequences, biodiversity loss, shifting hydrology, unequal exposure to toxins, and livelihood shocks. Throughout, I'll connect each piece back to our two frameworks, which are the treadmill of production and slow violence. So it's obvious how structure and time make these harms feel normal. I'll close with leverage points at three levels. So that's policy, firms, and communities. So we're going to end this presentation with actionable ideas rather than just problems. First, we'll talk about the two theories. The first one is the treadmill of production. It's simple, but I think it's very powerful. Modern economies reward um, throughput, which is moving more material and energy through the system because growth, jobs, and completion are tied to scale. In this setup, environmental costs become externalities, which means that they're pushed off corporate balance sheets and onto air, water, soil, and communities. That's why practices like large scale monoculture or weak enforcement can persist even when individuals care about the environment. The structure makes high throughput choices look rational. It also explains why quick, purely individual solutions underperform. Price signals and policy rules shape what choices are even possible. This lens will keep reappearing every time we ask, why do they keep doing this? Because it reframes the answer away from the personal mortality and towards incentives and institutions. Slow violence is the idea that a lot of environmental harm is not dramatic or immediate. It builds quietly, out of sight, and often out of the news cycle. Nixon illustrates this with communities affected by megadams and diversions. Benefits flow to some, while cost displacements and ecological loss accumulate for others, sometimes years later. He calls these communities ecologically unmoored, a phrase that captures how people can be cut from the resources that support their culture, diet, and identity on page 152. Slow violence matters for our topic because contamination or species decline doesn't always look like a disaster scene. It looks like a parent quietly switching what fish they serve their kids, or a fisher taking second jobs after stocks thin out. Real impacts that are easy to ignore unless we deliberately look for them. And then now we'll talk about our causes. Cause number one is fishing pressure and food web contamination. So freshwater and marine systems face sustained extraction pressure. Allen shows how inland waters experience overfishing that undermines biodiversity and long-term food security. In marine systems, Shortup and the other co-authors of the article find that climate change combined with overfishing can increase neurotoxicant burdens in top predators. Contaminants concentrate up the food chain, which raises health concerns for groups that rely on certain fish. At the national scale, Clark tracks how countries' fisheries footprints expand with economic development and over time, revealing a global treadmill dynamic where growth correlates with larger ecological claims. Taken together, this is a structural story. Enforcement gaps, market demand, and international trade keep pressure on ecosystems even when individuals make careful choices. Um, Now we'll talk about monoculture's inputs in corporate agriculture. Um, Peklaner argues that biotech era reshaped the political economy of farming, intellectual property over seeds, reliance on specific inputs, and data-driven agronomy can concentrate power and increase dependency for producers. That structure tilts decisions towards the thorough put first models. Field evidence shows that system design matters. Um, Aranut, they find that rice fish co-culture supports different soil microbial communities than rice monoculture. This is evidence that diversification can support resilience. Looking at root crops, Zuhuri and co-authors of the article document how corporate-based cassava models steer technology adoption and sustainability strategies in ways that shape long-term ecological outcomes. This is a treadmill logic expressed on the farm. When margins are thin and inputs are bundled with IP and credit, it's hard to exit high input path even if farmers want to. Looking at our third cause now, infrastructure that moves goods often moves organisms too, using structured expert judgment. Whitman assesses the risk that Asian carp could establish in the Great Lakes via hydraulic connections, highlighting how canals and locks act as invasion pathways. In cities, Riley shows how urbanization reshapes stream communities. Native amphibians decline while disturbance tolerant and invasive species become more common. Along aquaculture gradients, Moscovitz find conditions that favor invasive, outbreak, or pest species over non-pest assemblance. Agencies like the U.S. EPA document ongoing Great Lakes invasive threats and control strategies, reminding us that prevention and pathway management are often more effective than trying to fix the damage later. Um, and our last cause, food loss and waste are force multipliers. Every pound wasted also wastes the upstream land, water, energy, and emissions embedded in producing it. Laberge's review shows that while reducing loss and waste is practical and high impact, to think about systematic risk, it helps borrow the metaphor from complex systems. Um, Haldane compare banking networks to ecosystems where high connectivity can spread shocks quickly. Our food chains are similarly interconnected. Tight schedules, concentrated processing, and global sourcing can turn into a local disruption, into a broad shortage, or a price spike. The treadmill lens explains why firms optimize for efficiency, but that same efficiency can reduce buffers and resilience when something goes wrong. We'll talk about some consequences now. Um, so, social consequences, inequality, and health. These causes land unevenly on people. Nixon's slow violence lens explains why communities with less political power wait longer for remediation or enforcement, and why displacement can be social as well as physical. Shard Up shows how contamination can climb marine food webs, raising neurotoxin risks for populations that rely on certain fish species. Current ecological crises also ricochet through food systems in unexpected ways, reporting on the global bird flu outbreak that shows spillovers that affect wildlife, poultry, prices, and livelihoods at once. Finally, rural policy often assumes a narrow picture of who a farmer is. Peeney and the other colleagues that wrote that article argue that identity, gender, and care labor are frequently sidelined in design and implementation, which can make well-intentioned policies less fair and less effective on the ground. Um, Ecological consequences. Ecologically, the pattern points to loss of diversity and altered flows. Allen shows how overfishing erodes freshwater biodiversity and undermines ecosystem function. In urban watersheds, Riley finds that habitat alteration leads to biotic homogenization, which means that fewer sensitive species and more generalists and invasives. And as land use changes away from swidden systems, Ziegler and colleagues show shifts in hydrology and geomorphology, more runoff and erosion that can carry sediments and pollutants downstream. These are not isolated facts. They are connected outcomes of a high throughput model that treats ecological capacity as a background variable until something were to break. Um, Now I'm just going to conclude everything that we talked about. Um, Putting it all together, if we step back, I think that a lot of consistency appears. The treadmill lens explains why environmental costs are normalized. Subsidies, trade rules, intellectual property regimes, and consolidation reward throughput. The slow violence lens explains why the damage is politically quiet. It's gradual, dispersed, and hardest on those with the fewest resources. Global trade and technology lock in, add path dependence. Once infrastructure and supply chains are built for speed and volume, it's hard to switch to diversity and resilience. That's why individual virtue isn't enough. We need to change the rules that shape prices, information, and incentives so that better outcomes become the default rather than the exception. Um, Here are the practical moves at the three different levels. So for policy, manage pathways for invasives, engineer and operate canals and locks to reduce transfer risks, um, tie agricultural supports to measure outcomes in soil health and water quality, and enforce science-based catch limits to reduce collapse risks. For firms, diversify suppliers and invest in regenerative practices that improve soils and reduce chemical dependency. Internalize pollution costs so clean options compete fairly. And then communities and consumers, reducing food waste, a high impact step up that also lowers upstream pressures, and then diversifying diets so pressure isn't concentrated on a few vulnerable species. None of these alone is a silver bullet, but together they shift incentives away from throughput only and toward resilience and equity. Um, if there's one idea to remember, I think that it's food systems. Food system harms are patterned, they're not random. The harms persist because our rules and markets reward throughput while hiding costs, and because the damage accumulates slowly where it's easiest to ignore. Change the rules and incentives, and we'll end up changing the outcomes. Here's my sources. Thank you for listening.